Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the place where we take all of that dense research and distill it down into knowledge you can actually use right away.
Mm.
And today we are doing a really deep dive into, I think, the absolute fabric of physical vitality and longevity.
Yeah.
This is so critical for anyone who's focused on optimizing their health, managing weight in a smart way,
Right.
and maybe the most important piece, preserving strength and function, especially well into their senior years.
That's exactly it. And the sources we've pulled together for this they're just fascinating. We're really moving beyond the standard calories in, calories out conversation.
Thank goodness.
We're looking at core metabolic mechanisms. I mean, we're covering everything from these really high restriction diets, like intermittent fasting, keto.
Even the carnivore diet, which is
Mhm.
controversial to say the least.
Oh, definitely. But we're also looking at these newer, but actually really simple health metrics like waist to height ratio. And then we have this really surprising section on the biological impact of environmental factors that are, and this is the crazy part, literally stored in our own body fat.
Okay, so the mission for today is to cut through all that noise, right? The diet fads, the conflicting headlines.
Exactly.
We want to arm you with the metabolic keys, the actual mechanisms, the metrics you can use today, and the critical nutrient insights that are just essential for keeping that vitality, that muscle mass, that really define a high-functioning long life. We're looking for the biology that underpins true longevity.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We have to set the stage here, and the context for this entire conversation is the global obesity challenge. The numbers are, frankly, they're shocking.
They really are.
They just underscore why finding effective targeted strategies is so important. Between 1980 and 2019, the global prevalence of obesity, it just exploded.
Right.
It went from about 3.2% to 12.2% in men, and for women, it went from 6% to almost 16%.
That's a massive surge. I mean, we're talking about a multi-decade trend that shows our current health protocols are just struggling to keep pace.
They're failing.
They are. And it highlights why we have to change how we measure and manage body composition. Because obesity, it's not a cosmetic thing. It's a foundational risk factor for so many other problems.
Like what? What are the big ones?
Well, the big ones are type 2 diabetes, heart disease, even several types of cancer. They're all strongly associated with it. So if we can find and, get the word out on these cost-effective, easy-to-use strategies for managing weight, we can make a huge dent in the future rates of these chronic diseases.
And, for decades, our main tool, the one everyone hears about from their doctor, has been the body mass index, the BMI.
The infamous BMI.
Exactly. But the research you've brought forward makes a really compelling case that just relying on BMI or, just staring at that number on the scale, it's often misleading. It can even be counterproductive for someone who's genuinely trying to improve their metabolic health.
It's fundamentally flawed, especially for our listeners who are focused on vitality and strength. And here's why. BMI is just a simple ratio. It's your weight divided by your height squared.
That's it.
That's it. It tells you nothing, and I mean nothing, about what that weight is actually made of.
So it can't tell the difference between muscle and fat.
Not at all. Or bone density.
Yeah.
Or water weight.
Yeah.
So you could have someone who's really physically active. They build up a lot of muscle.
Right.
Which is a huge component of longevity.
Right.
And their BMI might actually creep into that overweight category. Meanwhile, their internal metabolic health could be fantastic.
And that must be so frustrating for people. You're doing all the right things, you're working out, you feel better, you're losing the bad fat and gaining good muscle, but this one metric tells you you're failing.
It's worse than frustrating. It can lead to actual clinical misdiagnoses. The sources had a really eye-opening example about this.
Oh, yeah.
It was about women diagnosed with a condition called lipoedema. It's a chronic issue with abnormal and often painful fat distribution, usually in the lower body.
So their body shape is just naturally different.
Exactly. A disproportionately larger lower half. Now, when they used BMI to classify this group, a staggering 63.6% of them were classified as obese.
Wow, 2/3 of them. Just based on that one calculation.
Just based on that. But listen to this. When they recategorized those exact same women using a much better metric, the waist to height ratio, or WHTR, the obesity diagnosis rate plummeted. It dropped by nearly half, down to 31.7%.
That is a massive difference.
It's huge because BMI just couldn't tell the difference between metabolically active fat and the peripheral fat in their lower body.
Right.
It completely obscured their real health status.
So some of those women labeled obese might have actually been metabolically healthy.
The evidence showed exactly that. Some who were obese by BMI were actually in the healthy range for WHTR, and their own self-reported markers, things like blood pressure and cholesterol, back that up. They were healthier.
So relying on BMI alone is it's a huge risk. You get wrong diagnoses, maybe wrong prescriptions, and a lot of unnecessary emotional stress.
Precisely.
That makes the case perfectly then. We have to shift our focus away from just total weight and toward the real danger, which is central adiposity.
Visceral fat.
Visceral fat. Why is that specific type of fat the one we need to be measuring and targeting?
Because central adiposity is the real metabolic villain. It's not like the subcutaneous fat, the jiggly stuff you can pinch just under your skin.
Right.
Visceral fat, the stuff that wraps around your internal organs in your abdomen, is far from inert. The research correctly identifies it as a pathologically active endocrine organ.
An endocrine organ. Okay, break that down. That means it's actively pumping out hormones and other molecules, right?
Exactly. This visceral fat tissue doesn't just sit there storing energy. It's like a little factory, churning out pro-inflammatory cytokines and signaling molecules that drive systemic body-wide inflammation.
And that inflammation is at the root of so many problems.
It is. It promotes insulin resistance. It puts a huge strain on the liver. It's directly linked to things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It is, by its very nature, inflammatory and metabolically unhealthy. The research is crystal clear on this. Central fatness, no matter what your BMI is strongly linked to an increased risk of dying from any cause.
So it's the location of the fat, not just the amount, that really matters.
That's the key takeaway. Location, location, location.
So if BMI is the wrong tool for the job, how do we accurately and, just as importantly, simply measure this dangerous central fat?
This is where the waist-to-height ratio, or WHTR, really shines. It's just a far superior and more actionable tool. Study after study has shown it's a better screening tool for cardiometabolic risk than BMI, or even just waist circumference on its own.
Why is that? Why is adding the height component so important?
Because it normalizes the measurement. A 36-inch waist on someone who is 5 feet tall is a very different risk profile than a 36-inch waist on someone who is 6'4".
Right, that makes total sense.
By creating a ratio, it becomes a universal metric that effectively quantifies that risk from central fat.
And this is where I think our sources give the most immediate, valuable takeaway from you listening. There's a single actionable rule, a global boundary value.
Yes.
It's something you can measure at home right now with a simple tape measure. No labs needed. Tell us about the critical half-height rule.
The half-height rule is beautiful in its simplicity, it's memorable, and it's clinically validated. It just states that you should aim to keep your waist circumference less than half of your height.
So if you're 6 feet tall, which is 72 inches,
your waist should measure less than 36 inches. Mathematically, it means your WHTR is less than 0.5.
And what happens when you hit that target?
Achieving and, importantly, sustaining that ratio is strongly associated with high-functioning longevity. It's considered one of the most effective ways to just exit the entire spectrum of metabolic disease.
So if your waist is more than half your height, you're carrying an increased risk, a life-shortening risk, no matter what the scale says.
That's it. It gives you a crystal clear, unambiguous target for reducing that dangerous visceral fat.
That makes the goal so concrete. But let's bring this back specifically to older adults and this concept of vitality. Reducing that visceral fat to hit that WHTR target, it's not just about your heart. It's deeply connected to your physical function, your mobility.
Absolutely. And that brings us right into the conversation around sarcopenia.
Which is a term maybe not everyone is familiar with.
Right. Sarcopenia is the silent threat to independence in later life. It's defined as the progressive, generalized loss of both muscle mass and muscle strength.
And what are the consequences?
It dramatically increases your risk of falls, it makes you more frail, it drives up hospitalization rates, and it elevates overall mortality in older adults. It's a huge deal.
And what's the direct connection to that central fat we were just talking about?
Well, the accumulation of visceral fat doesn't just sit there passively. It actively impairs your cardiovascular function and your metabolic health.
So that extra fat just makes it harder to move. It reduces your physical capacity.
Precisely. Your aerobic capacity and your endurance go down, which makes you less likely to be physically active, which then, of course, speeds up the cycle of muscle loss.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is, but there's an even deeper, more insidious link. Central adiposity is directly correlated with fat infiltration of the muscle itself.
Wait, so the fat is actually getting inside the muscle?
It's a process called myosteatosis, and it's a major pathological feature of sarcopenia. Essentially, that fat starts squeezing its way in between the muscle fibers, which directly impairs their ability to contract and function properly.
So the visceral fat isn't just causing inflammation outside the muscle, it's actively compromising the structure of the muscle from the inside out.
Exactly right. And we have clinical evidence to back this up. One study, using something called the longevity checkup protocol, found a really compelling link between having an abnormal WHTR and having significantly lower physical performance in older adults.
How do they measure that?
They used simple functional tests. One of them was the chair stand test.
That sounds simple.
It's deceptively simple, but it's a powerful measure of your lower body strength and function, things you need for everyday living.
And what did the test show for people with high central adiposity?
The individuals with that high central fat, so an abnormal WHTR above 0.5, consistently performed worse on the chair stand test.
And that's a huge finding.
It's critical because it translates directly into a lack of vitality. If you can't get up out of a chair efficiently, if that visceral fat is compromising your fundamental strength, it is directly hurting your day-to-day mobility, your resilience, and your independence. Hitting that WHTR target, it becomes a literal measure of functional longevity.
Okay, so that puts an immediate high priority on reducing visceral fat. Once you have the metric, the WHTR, the next logical step is the intervention. And this brings us right to diet and specifically to the goal of achieving what's called metabolic flexibility. Before we talk about how to get there, we have to define the goal. What does it actually mean to be metabolically flexible? Why is it considered the holy grail of metabolic health?
Metabolic flexibility is, at its core, your body's efficiency and agility in switching its main fuel source.
Fuel source.
Yeah. In an ideal world, your system should be able to seamlessly pivot between using glucose from carbohydrates for energy and then switching over to using fats and ketones from your stored body fat.
So you can burn either sugar or fat.
Exactly. And that ability to switch back and forth effortlessly is a powerful primary defense mechanism against the modern epidemics of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease.
So when you're metabolically inflexible, which I imagine is the state for a lot of people today.
The default state for many, yes.
What does that actually feel like? How would you know?
It feels like energy instability. You're completely reliant on a steady stream of glucose. This leads to those classic blood sugar spikes and then crashes. It's what makes you constantly hungry, gives you strong cravings for carbs, and makes you feel weak, shaky, or irritable if you miss a meal.
The hangry feel.
That's a perfect symptom of metabolic inflexibility. But when you are flexible, your energy is stable. Cravings are minimal. You can comfortably go for long periods without eating because your body just effortlessly taps into its vast reserves of stored body fat for fuel.
And the sources we've looked at suggest that one of the most effective ways to deliberately train and restore this flexibility is intermittent fasting, or IF.
IF is generating massive clinical interest for a good reason. The research is strongly validating its effectiveness. We're seeing meta-analyses that show different IF protocols, whether it's time-restricted eating, the 5.2 method, or alternate day fasting. They all lead to weight loss that's comparable to just continuous calorie restriction. But, and this is the key, the benefits run so much deeper than just weight loss because IF specifically forces that metabolic switch we just defined.
So how long does it take? How long do you have to fast to force your body to flip that switch and start burning stored fat instead of the sugar from your last meal?
That metabolic switch from using glucose to using fatty acids and eventually ketones, it typically happens somewhere between 12 and 36 hours after your last meal.
That's a pretty wide window.
It's a wide window because it really depends on the individual. It depends heavily on how full their glycogen stores were to begin with.
Glycogen being the stored sugar in your muscles and liver.
Correct. So it depends on how many carbs you ate leading up to the fast and also your physical activity level. If you did a high-intensity workout the day before, you'll burn through that glycogen much faster and flip the switch sooner.
I see.
But once you cross that 12 to 36-hour threshold, your body enters a new metabolic phase where it starts mobilizing and using lipids. That's your stored body fat for energy.
So by systematically training your body to use its own fat for fuel, it just makes intuitive sense that IVEV would have some pretty profound effects on heart health. What does the research show about its impact on the lipid profile? That's such a key metric for longevity, especially in older adults.
The findings here are overwhelmingly positive. I mean, they're highly favorable for cardiovascular health. if it effectively corrects something called dyslipidemia, which is just an imbalance of fats in the blood.
How does it do that?
It fundamentally remodels your circulating lipoproteins. We see a significant clinical drop in the lipids we usually label as bad or atherogenic. That includes VLDL, total LDL, and most importantly, the small, dense LDL particles.
The SDLDL. Why are those the most important ones to lower?
Because those are the little guys that are far more likely to wiggle their way into the arterial wall and cause damage. They are the main culprits in the development of atherosclerosis, or the hardening of the arteries.
Okay, so it lowers the bad stuff. What about the positive changes?
At the same time, AEEF also decreases your overall triglycerides, or TGs, and significantly increases your beneficial HDL cholesterol. So you get this amazing systemic shift across your entire lipid panel in a positive direction.
That's often the main goal for people worried about heart disease risk later in life.
Exactly.
Okay, this is where we need to move beyond just what happens and get into the how. This is so important for you if you're trying to really understand what's going on. How does a simple timing change like fasting reprogram your liver to get so much better at handling fats?
The mechanism is really elegant. It's rooted in gene expression. And it centers on two incredibly powerful transcription factors.
Okay.
They are called PPAR alpha and PGC1 alpha. Now, you don't need to remember the names. Just think of them as the master switches for fat burning inside your liver cells, your hepatocytes.
Master switches. I like that. So fasting flips these switches.
It does. When you fast, your body enhances the expression and the activity of both of these factors in the liver. They are powerful regulators of lipid metabolism. When they get upregulated by that fasting signal, they kickstart a process called fatty acid oxidation.
Which means?
It just means they crank up the liver's machinery to break down and burn fat for energy. It increases fatty acid uptake and transport, which directly leads to less storage of triglycerides, both in the liver itself and in the surrounding fat tissues.
And when there's less fat and fewer triglycerides sitting around in the liver, the production line for those dangerous lipoproteins has to slow down.
That's exactly it. The downstream effect is a reduced production and secretion of very low-density lipoproteins, VLDLs, by the liver. And since VLDL is the precursor particle that ultimately gets turned into those dangerous, small, dense LDLs,
you're cutting the problem off at the source.
You're cutting it off at the source.
Right.
Understanding that pathway, that IF physically changes your gene expression to favor burning fat over storing it, that really solidifies why it has such a profound cardioprotective effect.
Moving on from heart health, let's talk about inflammation. We know chronic low-grade inflammation is a huge driver of nearly every age-related disease. We already established that visceral fat is inflammatory, but can IF actively suppress the inflammation that's being caused by the fat itself?
Yes, and this is another one of the most critical findings in the research stack. IFF actively suppresses that persistent low-grade inflammatory state that's associated with white adipose tissue, or WAT accumulation. See, in the context of obesity, that accumulation of fat tissue creates a really hostile environment at the cellular level. It triggers a shift. Your helpful anti-inflammatory M2 macrophages switch over and become pro-inflammatory M1 macrophages.
Let's make that super clear. What are macrophages doing in our fat tissue in the first place?
Think of macrophages as the immune system's cleanup and defense crew. In a healthy state, the M2 macrophages are the cleanup crew. They promote healing, they're anti-inflammatory.
The good guys.
The good guys. But when obesity causes fat cells to get too big and die off, the M1 macrophages rush in as the emergency responders. These M1 cells cluster around the dead fat cells. Scientists literally call them crown-like structures, and they immediately start releasing a barrage of pro-inflammatory signals.
And what are those specific signals, the inflammatory markers we should know about?
The M1s release cytokines like tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, IL-6, and they cause a rise in C-reactive protein, CRP. These are the absolute signature markers of chronic systemic inflammation.
So how does IF stop this?
FF counteracts this entire cycle. It promotes the switching back from the pro-inflammatory M1s to the anti-inflammatory M2s. This reduces the formation of those destructive crown-like structures, and it inhibits that massive release of inflammatory cytokines. It's a fundamental biological reversal of the inflammatory signal being driven by the fat.
That's just powerful. It's like you're reprogramming the immune response within your own fat tissue. And you mentioned there's an even deeper effect related to, of all things, the oxygen supply in the fat tissue. That seems incredible.
It really speaks to the systemic nature of how the body tries to repair itself. When fat tissue accumulates really rapidly, the new fat cells grow faster than the blood vessels around them can keep up.
So they outgrow their supply lines.
Perfectly put. This leads to a state where the demand for oxygen and nutrients can't be met. We call this local hypoxia. And this lack of oxygen causes more damage, which just further contributes to the inflammation and cell death.
So the fat tissue is literally choking itself, which just makes the whole disease process worse.
Correct. But here's the amazing part. EDEF has been shown to alleviate this hypoxia.
Oh.
It does it by stimulating angiogenesis, which is just the physiological process of creating new blood vessels. It does this by upregulating a specific molecule called VEGF-A. By growing new blood vessels right into the fat tissue, EDEF improves the oxygen supply. This reduces hypoxia, which in turn reduces inflammation and promotes more anti-inflammatory activity.
It's a total systemic reset. It's affecting everything from your liver genes to the tiny blood vessels inside your fat cells.
It's the ultimate metabolic cleanup.
And this conversation just flows so naturally into the even more restrictive low-carb protocols like the ketogenic diet. Keto basically forces that metabolic flexibility 24/7 by keeping you in a state of nutritional ketosis.
Right. Ketogenic and these other very low-carb diets, they certainly show profound metabolic effects.
Yeah.
The evidence is clear that they result in greater long-term weight loss when compared to the typical low-fat diets that were popular for so long.
That's a huge draw for people looking for results.
It is. And for patients who are already managing type 2 diabetes, these approaches can be game-changing. They significantly reduce the need for insulin and other medications, and they consistently lower HbA1c, which is that long-term measure of blood sugar control.
Because you're taking the sugar out of the equation.
You are. And you're dramatically improving the body's overall insulin sensitivity.
So the results for blood sugar and visceral fat sound incredible, but we always have to approach these highly restrictive diets with a bit of caution. What's the major caveat here, the thing you absolutely have to monitor if you're considering keto?
This is the critical piece for long-term health, and it's confirmed by multiple analyses. While these diets often improve the big picture of cardiometabolic risk, they lower triglycerides and raise HDL, they do have the potential to significantly raise LDL cholesterol in some people. And since LDL is still considered a primary cardiovascular risk marker, anyone undertaking a very restrictive low-carb approach needs careful follow-up. You have to be regularly monitoring your full lipid panel with a doctor.
So you have to make sure you're not trading one problem for another.
Exactly. You don't want to trade great metabolic gains for a new cardiac risk signal.
That is vital context. Okay, let's pivot now. Let's talk about the second major component of vitality, which is all about maintaining strength and structure. We can't talk about functional longevity without talking about preserving muscle.
We can't.
And that brings us to protein intake and the role of high-quality animal sources.
Right. Sarcopenia prevention, like we talked about, is just paramount. And the fundamental problem for older adults is that just eating the standard recommended dietary allowance, the RDA for protein, is often not enough.
Why not?
Because the aging body develops something called anabolic resistance.
Anabolic resistance?
Yeah.
That sounds like your body is just ignoring the signals that are supposed to tell your muscles to grow and repair themselves.
That's a perfect way to describe it. In older adults, the muscle cells become less sensitive to the building blocks, the amino acids from protein. It takes a higher dose of amino acids, especially one called leucine, to trigger muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, compared to when you were younger.
So you need more protein to get the same muscle building effect.
Significantly more. To counteract that resistance and make sure those muscle building signals fire properly, older adults generally need a higher protein intake, somewhere in the range of 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight each day.
And high-quality meat is a very efficient way to hit those higher targets.
It's an excellent, highly bioavailable source of the high-quality protein you need for both muscle and bone. And not all proteins are created equal when it comes to their amino acid profile for this purpose.
Can you give us some specific, actionable numbers from the sources? How much protein in a meal is needed to really maximize that muscle-building response?
Yes. The research on sarcopenia prevention found that a very specific dose of 113 grams of lean beef, that's about a 4-ounce serving, was highly effective. That serving delivers about 30 grams of high-quality protein for around 220 calories. And that specific amount was shown to increase muscle protein synthesis by about 50% in both young and older volunteers.
So 30 grams seems to be a key threshold per meal.
It's a very effective dose. The recommendation within a healthy, varied diet is to consume lean red meat about 4 to 5 times a week and to be very conscious about limiting processed meat to less than once a week. The quality and the type really do matter.
So it's not just the amount of protein, it's the quality and the presence of other specific active compounds in meat that are crucial here. What are these other metabolic signals we're getting from meat?
Meat really delivers a trifecta of key bioactive compounds. The first, and most important, is leucine.
The amino acid you mentioned before.
Right. Leucine acts as the primary on switch for something called the mTOR pathway. You can think of mTOR as the master regulator that kicks off all muscle growth and repair. If you don't get enough leucine in a meal to hit that threshold, the MPS process just stalls, no matter how much total protein you ate.
So leucine is the key that starts the engine. What are the other two parts of the trifecta?
The others are creatine and carnitine. Creatine, which is found naturally in red meat, is really important because getting enough of it can be a great way to counteract this specific fatigue that comes with sarcopenia. It helps with immediate energy supply for muscle work.
And carnitine.
Carnitine is like a shuttle bus. It facilitates the transfer of long-chain fatty acids into the mitochondria, the power plants of your cells, so they can be burned for ATP, which is cellular energy. All three of these work together to help your body efficiently fuel, use, and maintain its muscle tissue.
Now we have to tackle the big question, the elephant in the room when it comes to meat. The long-standing association between red and processed meat and higher levels of inflammation. What does the latest, more nuanced research tell us about that link, especially in older adults?
This is one of the most important takeaways, I think, for anyone trying to navigate those contradictory health headlines. There was a large, complex study that looked at a multi-ethnic group of older adults from age 45 to 75. And initially, they saw what everyone expects to see.
Which is?
An association. The people with higher intakes of red and processed meat also showed higher levels of inflammatory markers, specifically leptin and C-reactive protein, or CRP. This was particularly true in women.
So at first glance, the data confirms the fear. More meat equals more inflammation.
That is the simple, unadjusted finding. But this is where it gets interesting. The researchers then did a much more sophisticated multivariate analysis. They were specifically trying to figure out the mediating effect of body composition.
Meaning they wanted to see if body fat levels were playing a role.
Exactly. And here's the crucial insight. When they statistically controlled for body mass index, so when they factored out the overall degree of adiposity, or excess body fat, this statistically significant link between red and processed meat and those inflammatory markers, it largely disappeared. It became non-significant.
Okay, let's pause there, because that's huge. What does that massive shift imply about where the inflammation is actually coming from?
It strongly suggests that, within the context of this study, the degree of excess body weight, or adiposity, the presence of that pathologically active, inflammatory visceral fat we talked about at the beginning,
right,
that is the primary driver linking meat intake to the high inflammatory markers, not the meat itself.
So the inflammatory signal is coming from the fat tissue the person is carrying, not from the steak they're eating.
Provided their consumption falls within healthy patterns, yes. The inflammation is coming from the adiposity. This is a vital distinction for anyone who's trying to maintain muscle while aggressively reducing their body fat.
It completely reframes the debate. It shifts the blame from the high-quality protein source to the excess energy reservoir, the fat. But what happens if someone takes this high-protein focus to its logical extreme? What about the carnivore diet?
The carnivore diet is, it's an extreme protocol. It aims for 0 carbohydrates. And while it certainly delivers on that high-protein mandate for preserving muscle, and yes, it can cause rapid weight loss by forcing metabolic flexibility, but it carries substantial and, frankly, predictable risks when it comes to nutrient adequacy, especially if your variety is limited. We have to be realistic about its long-term sustainability and nutritional completeness.
So when researchers actually model the nutrient content of these very restrictive diets, what are the biggest red flags that pop up?
The list of potential problems is long, and it really highlights why dietary diversity is so valued in nutrition. The core micronutrients of concern that were identified in case studies include thiamine, magnesium, calcium, vitamin C, and potassium.
And what about others?
Folate and iodine were also potentially inadequate in some of the meal plans they modeled. But the most universal, the most glaring deficiency by far was fiber.
Which makes sense. If you're not eating any plants, your fiber intake has to be close to 0.
It is. Across all the carnivore meal plans they analyzed, fiber intake was less than 1% of the adequate intake or recommended daily intake.
Well, what are the consequences of that?
Well, there are immediate implications for your gut health. You're essentially starving your beneficial gut microbes. But there are potential long-term issues, too, related to colon health. Plus, you lose fiber's amazing ability to help slow down glucose absorption and stabilize your blood sugar.
So, given these really stark concerns, how do people who follow this diet try to get around those nutritional gaps?
Well, mitigation requires strategies that go way beyond just eating steaks and chicken breasts. The deficiencies can really only be compensated for by eating a much wider, more varied array of animal products. It's often called a nose-to-tail approach.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so if you just eat muscle meat, you won't get enough vitamin A or certain B vitamins. So you have to include organ meats like liver. That becomes essential. To cover minerals like calcium and magnesium, you have to incorporate things like bone broth or tinned fish or with edible bones like sardines.
So, if you can't or won't eat that wide variety, you're in trouble.
Then supplementation is often not just a good idea, it becomes a necessity, especially when you're first starting or for anyone who begins the diet from a place of poor nutrient status to begin with.
Okay, this entire conversation so far has been about what we eat, when we eat it, and how we measure the results. But this final section, it introduces a really surprising environmental layer that changes the whole conversation about fat loss. This is the concept of the toxin reservoir.
This is the data that really puts a necessary layer of caution on any rapid fat loss effort. Most of us think of our adipose tissue, our fat, as just an energy storage locker.
Right.
But it is also the body's long-term biological sink for highly lipophilic, which just means fat-loving environmental contaminants. We call them persistent organic pollutants, or POPs.
And these are chemicals that are they're everywhere in our modern world. What kind of POPs are we talking about?
We're talking about things like certain organochlorine pesticides. DDT and its breakdown product DDE are famous examples. And industrial chemicals like PCBs. Because they are so extremely fat-soluble, our bodies don't excrete them easily. Instead, they get stored away in the lipid matrix of our fat cells.
So they just build up over time.
They can accumulate and reside there for decades. It literally turns your stored body fat into a living, toxic time capsule of your environmental exposures.
And when these POPs are locked away in the fat cells, do they just sit there quietly? Or are they actively messing with our metabolism?
Oh, they are absolutely interfering. And this is where the research gets deeply concerning. These toxins disrupt our metabolic signaling pathways, and they compromise the normal function of our fat cells.
How do they do that?
One of the main ways is through a special receptor in our fat cells called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, or APR.
What's the normal job of the AHR?
Its normal job is to regulate the cell's response to foreign chemicals, a xenobiotic response. It's involved in influencing body weight, fat mass, lipid balance. It's supposed to be a protective mechanism.
But the POPs hijack it.
They hijack it. When POPs bind to it, they mess with its function. And while the research on what happens next is complex, some studies show activation suppresses fat creation. Others suggest a deficiency protects against obesity. The data is clear that these environmental inputs are pathologically messing with the regulation of our fat cells. They are throwing a wrench in the genetic programming of the fat cell itself.
And the disruption goes even further, right? It directly interferes with our critical hormone receptors, which basically control our entire metabolism and body weight.
That is the most direct and scary threat. We see interference with two key hormonal systems that govern metabolism and body composition. And these are systems that are so crucial for older adults trying to maintain muscle and healthy fat levels.
Okay, let's start with the one that's most often associated with female metabolism.
First, the estrogen receptors, or ERs. When these POPs bind to that AHR we just talked about, the resulting complex can inhibit estrogen signaling. And this is profoundly significant because we know that estrogen deficiency, or a lack of functional estrogen signaling, is itself associated with increased obesity and fat mass.
So the toxins are blocking the very signals that help keep our metabolism healthy.
In a way, yes. They're disrupting them. And it's not just estrogen.
What about the hormone system we associate more with muscle and male vitality?
The androgen receptors, or ARs, are also a primary target. Many of these POPs, like DDE and some PCBs, act as androgen receptor antagonists.
An antagonist means it blocks the receptor's normal action.
It blocks it. And this is so crucial because testosterone, which uses that receptor, has been shown to stimulate efficient glucose uptake in our fat cells. So if these environmental toxins are blocking that receptor, it could impair how our adipose tissue functions and, as a result, reduce our systemic insulin sensitivity.
These toxins are literally disrupting the hormonal signals that are supposed to govern healthy fat storage, blood sugar control, and muscle integrity.
Yes. They are a major confounding variable in metabolic health.
This completely changes the risk profile of losing weight. If our fat is a storage depot for decades of environmental toxins, then when you start to rapidly burn that fat, it's not just mobilizing energy. It's a massive, sudden release of all those contaminants back into your bloodstream.
You've hit on the most crucial practical implication for anyone listening who is actively trying to lose weight with IF or low-carb diets.
So what does that mean in practice?
It means that when your stored fat undergoes lipolysis, that's the rapid breakdown process you need for significant weight loss. All those sequestered, highly concentrated toxins get released back into circulation. This rapid influx creates what scientists call a state of internal exposure. Your blood concentration of these toxins can temporarily skyrocket.
And what happens if your body isn't ready for that sudden toxic load?
Well, if your body's main detoxification pathways, which are principally the 3 phases of liver detox, if they're not working optimally, or if they're just completely overwhelmed by this sudden dump of toxins, this internal exposure can result in potential damage to other organs. The irony is that the risk of toxicity is actually higher during periods of successful, aggressive weight loss.
That is a serious warning, and it really brings everything we've talked about full circle. Achieving that optimal WHTR, getting metabolically flexible, the very act of burning fat for fuel, it's all intrinsically tied to managing this hidden toxic load.
Exactly. It adds a necessary layer of complexity and caution to any weight management plan. And this is especially true for older adults who might have had a longer lifespan to accumulate these toxins. Achieving metabolic cleanliness means you have to focus not just on the fuel you're putting in, but also on proactively supporting your liver's ability to process the toxins that get released when you successfully burn that old contaminated fuel.
So for anyone undertaking significant fat loss, focusing on supportive nutrition for detoxification, it's not optional anymore.
It becomes a fundamental part of the health protocol. It's essential for ensuring safe, long-term vitality. So let's try to bring all these powerful insights together. We could distill it down to 3 pillars for achieving that physical vitality and robust metabolic health based on all this diverse data we've covered.
Okay, pillar 1.
First, we have to change our metric. We need to prioritize the waist-to-height ratio, the WHTR, over the old misleading BMI. That allows us to accurately target visceral fat with a clear goal of getting that ratio below 0.5.
Pillar 2.
Second, we need to leverage metabolic switching. We can do that with strategies like intermittent fasting and low-carb approaches. This will optimize your lipid profile, lower your triglycerides, and reduce that systemic inflammation by flipping your macrophages back to the good guys and improving oxygen supply to the tissue.
And the third pillar, for strength.
Third, to preserve the strength that is absolutely essential for vitality, you have to ensure you're getting adequate, high-quality protein and key nutrients. Aim for that higher target, 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, to overcome that age-related anabolic resistance. And use the insight from that mediating analysis to focus your efforts on reducing your adiposity, your body fat, which is the real source of inflammation, not the protein itself.
And that wraps up our analysis for today. We started this deep dive looking for actionable steps to optimize health, which is such a focus for so many American seniors and really for everyone. And we ended up in the worlds of molecular biology and environmental toxicology. I think the big takeaway is that successful fat loss is so much more complex than just counting calories. It's more than just shrinking cells. It's an act of deep cellular and hormonal detoxification, and it requires serious metabolic support.
Which leads us to one final provocative thought for you to carry forward with you.
Let's hear it.
If environmental toxins stored in our body fat directly interfere with the critical hormone pathways that regulate our insulin sensitivity, our blood sugar control, and our body weight, pathways like the estrogen and androgen receptors, does achieving optimal health and long-term vitality in our modern world now require us to view proactive environmental avoidance and internal detoxification support as the true fundamental first step in any comprehensive weight loss and anti-aging protocol?
Something to think about as you go find a tape measure this week.